Mystery awaits at Ravenwood Lodge with Miss Marple ** Chapter 1. The invitation to Fernley Vale. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from her garden, mingling with the comforting aroma of chamomile tea steaming in a delicate porcelain cup. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm, a half-finished scarf of soft wool pooling in her lap. The quiet of the village enveloped her, broken only by the distant trill of a blackbird and the occasional creak of her old oak floorboards. It was a moment of perfect serenity, the kind that invited reflection on the small dramas of village life until the sharp rap of the postman's knock disrupted her reverie. Cherry, her cheerful young maid, bustled in with a silver tray bearing a single letter. "For you, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Looks fancy, doesn't it? Not the usual sort of post." Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her frail hands deftly adjusting her spectacles as she examined the envelope. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and embossed with a subtle crest, a raven perched atop an oak branch. The handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned, addressed to her in a flowing script that stirred a flicker of memory. She slit the envelope with a letter opener, her movements precise, and unfolded the letter within. "My dearest Jane," it began. "I trust this finds you in good health and spirits. It has been far too many years since our paths crossed at Miss Porter's academy, but I have followed your remarkable exploits with admiration. I write to invite you to Ravenwood Lodge in Fernley Vale, Devon, for a small gathering to mark my 60th birthday. The occasion calls for old friends and lively company, but I confess, there are troubling matters afoot that would benefit from your singular insight. Your presence would be a comfort and perhaps a necessity. Do come, Jane, if you can spare the time. Yours affectionately, Eleanor Prescott. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she reread the letter. Eleanor Prescott, née Eleanor Langley, had been a spirited girl at school, quick to laugh but prone to secrets. The phrase "troubling matters" lingered in Miss Marple's mind, a subtle signal of distress cloaked in polite invitation. She tapped the letter against her palm, her thoughts drifting to the countless times such understated pleas had led her to unravel the tangled threads of human nature. "Well, Cherry," she said, folding the letter neatly, "it seems I shall be taking a little journey. Pack my gray tweed suitcase, if you please, and include the blue cardigan. Devon can be chilly in spring." 2 days later, Miss Marple alighted from a rattling train at Fernley Vale's modest station, her sensible hat firmly pinned against the brisk April breeze. The platform was a quaint affair, bordered by pots of blooming primroses and overseen by a station master who tipped his cap with a smile. A hired car, arranged by Eleanor, awaited her. Its driver, a ruddy-faced man named Mr. Hawkins, who spoke fondly of Ravenwood Lodge, grand old place. "Miss," he said as they wound through lanes flanked by hedgerows and grazing sheep. "Mrs. Prescott's a fine lady, keeps the village ticking along. Pity about all the whispers, though." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, inviting elaboration, but Mr. Hawkins only chuckled. "Oh, village talk, miss. You'll hear plenty soon enough." Fernley Vale unfolded before her like a scene from a pastoral painting. Cottages with thatched roofs clustered around a cobbled market square, where stalls offered fresh bread, jars of honey, and bolts of homespun cloth. The church spire rose above ancient yews, its clock chiming 4 as children scampered across the green, their laughter mingling with the clatter of a passing horse cart. Ravenwood Lodge stood at the village's edge, a Georgian manor of honey-colored stone, its gabled roofs and tall chimneys framed by sprawling oaks. Ivy clung to its walls, softening the severe lines of its architecture, and a gravel drive curved toward a portico where Eleanor Prescott waited. "Jane, my dear," Eleanor exclaimed, descending the steps with a warmth that barely masked the strain in her eyes. She was a handsome woman, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her navy dress tailored but understated. Her embrace was firm, yet Miss Marple noted the faint tremble in her hands. "How good of you to come. The journey wasn't too taxing, I hope?" Her voice was bright, but her glance darted toward the lodge, as if expecting an unwelcome shadow to emerge. "Not at all, Eleanor," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but probing. "The countryside is quite charming. And your home, why? It's magnificent." She allowed her gaze to sweep the manor, noting the polished windows, the well-tended rosebeds, and a faint scuff on the doorframe, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Eleanor's smile flickered, and she ushered Miss Marple inside, where a high-ceilinged hall greeted them with the scent of beeswax and old wood. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister gleaming, and portraits of stern-faced Prescotts lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the new arrival. The drawing room was a study in comfort, with chintz armchairs, a crackling fire, and a tea tray laden with scones and clotted cream. Eleanor introduced the other guests, each of whom Miss Marple observed with the quiet intensity of a naturalist studying rare specimens. Lawrence Prescott, Eleanor's nephew, was a lanky man in his 30s, his dark hair tousled and his artist's smock flecked with paint. His charm was effortless, but his restless fingers betrayed unease. Clara Dunhill, Eleanor's cousin, was a widow of sharp features and sharper tongue, her black dress severe against her pale skin. Dr. Henry Vaughan, the village physician, was a stout man with a kindly demeanor, though his eyes flicked nervously. To Eleanor, Sylvia Trent, a young novelist with auburn curls and a penchant for scribbling in a leather notebook, spoke of researching local folklore, her enthusiasm tinged with secrecy. Dinner was served in a dining room aglow with candlelight, the table set with silver and crystal that spoke of old wealth. The meal roast lamb, minted peas, and a delicate syllabub was exquisite, yet the conversation faltered. Eleanor's attempts at levity were strained, her laughter too quick to fade. Lawrence spoke of his latest painting, a stormy landscape, but his eyes strayed to a locked drawer in a sideboard, its brass key glinting in the candlelight. Claire's remarks were barbed, particularly toward Lawrence, whom she called a dreamer with no sense of duty. Dr. Vaughan offered medical anecdotes, but his hands fidgeted with his napkin. Sylvia, meanwhile, asked pointed questions about the lodge's history, her pen scratching furiously as Eleanor deflected with vague replies. Miss Marple sipped her wine, her serene expression belying the mental notes she was compiling. She recalled a similar dinner in St. Mary Mead, where a locked drawer had hidden a will that sparked betrayal. Eleanor's unease, the drawer, the undercurrents of resentment, it was a familiar pattern, one that often preceded darker deeds. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor rose, her face pale. "I'm feeling a touch weary," she said, her voice barely steady. "Do excuse me, Jane, we'll have a proper chat tomorrow." She retired, leaving the guests to disperse, their footsteps echoing in the silent manor. Alone in her guest room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed as she gazed at the moonlit oaks. The lodge was beautiful, but its air was heavy with secrets. Eleanor's letter, the locked drawer, the guests' guarded glances, they were pieces of a puzzle she was already assembling. She thought of a girl in St. Mary Mead who'd hidden a letter from her lover only to find it wielded as a weapon. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. Always the same, whether in a village or a manor. She retired to bed, her mind alert, sensing that Fernley Valley's tranquility was about to shatter. Chapter 2. The cryptic letter the morning after Miss Marple's arrival at Ravenwood. Lodge dawned with a heavy mist cloaking Fernley Vale, softening the outlines of the ancient oaks and muffling the distant bleat of sheep. Inside the manor, however, the air crackled with a different kind of fog, one of shock and dread. Miss Marple was roused from her light slumber by an urgent knock at her door. It was Betsy, the young housemaid, her face pale as chalk, her apron twisted in trembling hands. "Oh, miss, it's dreadful," she stammered. "Mrs. Prescott, she's dead." Found in her study, and the door locked tight. Miss Marple's serene expression masked the quickening of her pulse. She slipped on her dressing gown, her mind already sifting through the possibilities as she followed Betsy down the polished corridor. The study, located at the end of the east wing, was a handsome room with tall windows overlooking the misty garden, their heavy drapes drawn back to reveal the gray dawn. A crowd had gathered, servants whispering, guests in disarray, and the butler, Mr. Grayson, attempting to maintain order with a strained voice. Eleanor Prescott lay slumped at her mahogany desk, her silver hair spilling across a blotter stained with ink. A single stab wound marred her chest, the blood stark against her cream silk blouse. The murder weapon, a silver letter opener with an ornate raven handle, lay beside her, its blade dulled by crimson. The door, still locked when Betsy had screamed for help, had been forced open by Lawrence, who now stood ashen-faced in the corner. The key, curiously, remained in the lock on the inside. Inspector Harold Grange, summoned from the nearby town of Exeter, arrived with a clatter of boots and a no-nonsense demeanor. A burly man with a bristling mustache, he surveyed the scene, with narrowed eyes, his notebook already open. "Right then," he barked, addressing the huddled guests. "Nobody leaves this house until I've had statements. Time of death, Dr. Vaughn?" The physician, his face drawn, estimated midnight. Based on the body's rigidity, Grange's gaze fell on the crumpled paper beneath Eleanor's hand-letter, its ink fresh and its words chilling. "The raven's shadow falls at midnight. Truth will out." Miss Marple, standing quietly near a bookshelf, noted the letters. Theatrical tone, as if it were a line from a Gothic novel. She caught Grange's eye, and with a nod from Lawrence, who vouched for her reputation, she was invited to observe the investigation. The study was a treasure trove of details, and Miss Marple's keen eyes missed nothing. The desk was cluttered with papers, estate accounts, a guest list for the birthday gathering, and a half-finished note in Eleanor's hand, addressed to her solicitor about urgent amendments. A crystal inkwell had tipped over, its contents pooling near the letter, suggesting a struggle or haste. The windows were bolted, their latches rusted from disuse, and the chimney was too narrow for entry. The walls, lined with leather-bound books and portraits of Cern Prescott ancestors, offered no obvious hiding places. Yet Miss Marple's fingers brushed a faint scratch on the windowsill, barely visible in the morning light. She filed it away, her mind turning to a case in St. Mary Mead where a locked room had proven less secure than it seemed. Inspector Grange began his interrogations in the drawing room, and Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in a corner, her knitting resumed as a pretext for listening. Lawrence was first, his voice unsteady as he recounted his evening. He'd argued with Eleanor about selling Ravenwood Lodge, which he hoped to keep as a haven for his art. She was stubborn, he admitted, running a hand through his tousled hair. But I'd never harm her. I was in my room by 11, sketching. His alibi was unverified, and Grange pressed him on the letter, which Lawrence claimed to know nothing about. Miss Marple noted his clenched fists, wondering if grief or guilt tightened them. Clara Dunhill followed, her black dress as severe as her expression. She claimed to have retired early, reading in her room until sleep came. Eleanor was foolish to cling to this crumbling pile, she said, her voice sharp. Selling it would have freed us all. Her disdain for Lawrence was palpable, and when asked about the letter, she scoffed. Melodramatic nonsense. Probably one of Sylvia's. Scribbles. Miss Marple's needles paused, catching Clara's quick glance at the locked drawer from the previous night. A woman scorned, she thought, recalling a St. Mary Mead widow who'd hidden her envy behind piety. Dr. Vaughan, next, was cooperative but guarded. He had checked on Eleanor at 10, finding her anxious but well. She mentioned a family matter, he said, adjusting his spectacles. Nothing specific. He'd been in his room, reviewing medical journals at midnight. Miss Marple noted his fidgeting hands, wondering if his loyalty to Eleanor extended beyond professional duty. Sylvia Trent, the last to be questioned, was a bundle of nerves, her auburn curls escaping their pins. She'd been writing in the library until 11, inspired by the lodge's atmosphere. The letter, she insisted, wasn't hers, though. Her eyes darted to her notebook, clutched tightly. Miss Marple recalled a young writer in St. Mary Mead whose stories masked her own secrets, and Sylvia's evasiveness rang a similar bell. Grange dismissed the guess, confiding in Miss Marple that the locked room baffled him. No footprints in the garden, no signs of forced entry, he muttered, and that letter sounds like a warning, but from whom? Miss Marple suggested examining Eleanor's diary, which Grayson retrieved from the locked drawer. Its entries were cryptic, mentioning a burden tied to her late husband, Reginald Prescott, a collector of rare manuscripts who'd vanished years ago amid scandal. One entry read, "The Raven watches still. I must protect the truth, whatever the cost." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The Raven motif, repeated in the letter and diary, hinted at a family secret, perhaps tied to Reginald's disgraced dot as the household. Dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the study, her gaze returning to the windowsill scratch. She tested the bolt, finding it looser than expected, as if tampered with. A faint smudge of dirt on the sill suggested an outside approach, despite Grange's claim of no footprints. She thought of a gardener in St. Mary Mead who'd used a ladder to stage a burglary, leaving only faint marks. Stepping into the garden, she examined the ground beneath the window, where the mist had preserved a subtle indentation in the grass. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark her suspicion that the locked room was carefully crafted. Illusioned out back in the drawing room, the guests reconvened for a somber lunch, their appetites dulled by grief and suspicion. Lawrence sketched absently, his pencil tracing raven wings. Clara sipped tea, her eyes cold as she watched Sylvia, who scribbled furiously, her notebook now hidden beneath a shawl. Dr. Vaughan murmured condolences, but his gaze strayed to the study door. Miss Marple, nibbling a scone, observed their interplay, her mind weaving connections. The letter's metaphor, the diary's warnings, the scratch on the sill, they were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and she was determined to unravel it as the mist lifted, revealing Fernley Vale's rolling hills. Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settle around her. Eleanor's death was no random act. It was a calculated move rooted in the lodges. Shadowed past. She thought of a St. Mary Mead murder, where a cryptic note had masked the killer's intent. Human nature, she murmured, her needles clicking softly. It always leaves a trace. The day stretched ahead, promising revelations, and Miss Marple was ready to follow the raven's shadow wherever it led. Chapter 3. Shadows of the past, the mist that had cloaked Fernley Vale the previous day had lifted by Sunday morning, revealing a sky of pale blue streaked with wispy clouds. The village stirred early, its cobbled streets alive with the clatter of carts and the chatter of parishioners heading to St. Cuthbert's Church for the morning service. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her Sunday best, a navy coat and a hat adorned with a single violet, walked arm in arm with Lawrence Prescott, who had offered to escort her. The church, a Norman structure with a squat tower and stained glass windows, stood at the heart of the village, its bells tolling a solemn welcome. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in the scene. The butcher's wife whispering to the postmistress, the children tugging at their starched collars, and the vicar, Mr. Timothy Reed, greeting his flock with a strained smile. Eleanor's death, she knew, would cast a long shadow over the service. Inside, the church was cool and dim, the air thick with the scent of polished pews and wilting lilac from a recent wedding. Miss Marple settled into a pew near the back, her prayer book open but her attention on the congregation. The villagers' glances darted toward the Prescott pew, where Lawrence sat alone, his head bowed. Clara Dunhill, seated a row behind, stared fixedly at the altar, her lips a thin line. Dr. Vaughan, beside her, fidgeted his hymn book, while Sylvia Trent, in a corner pew, scribbled in her notebook, her pen scratching like a restless insect. The vicar's sermon on forgiveness and the burdens of truth felt pointed, his voice faltering, as he mentioned recent sorrows. Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, recalling a St. Mary Mead curate whose sermons had masked his own guilt. Words, she murmured to herself, are such revealing things. After the service, the congregation spilled onto the churchyard, where gravestones tilted like forgotten sentinels. Miss Marple lingered, accepting a cup of tea from a trestle table manned by the Women's Institute. She struck up a conversation with Mrs. Agnes Booth, the village gossip, whose eyes gleamed with the promise of scandal. Terrible about Mrs. Prescott, Agnes began, her voice low but eager. And to think it happened in her own study, locked tight. Reminds me of her husband Reginald, bless his soul or curse it, depending who you ask. Miss Marple's gentle prompting drew out the tale. Reginald Prescott, a collector of rare manuscripts, had vanished 20 years ago after a scandal involving a stolen medieval text. Some said he'd fled to the continent, others that he'd met a darker fate. Eleanor had borne the shame, rebuilding the family's name through charity and charm, but Agnes hinted that Clara Dunhill resented her cousin's inheritance of Ravenwood Lodge. Clara's always had a sharp tongue, Agnes confided, and sharper ambitions. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sifting through Anna's words. A stolen manuscript, a vanished husband, a resentful cousin, these were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to recognize. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who'd harbored grudges over an inheritance, her bitterness spilling into deceit. As the crowd thinned, Miss Marple approached the vicar, complimenting his sermon with a disarming smile. Mr. Reed, a wiry man with a nervous tic, seemed grateful for the distraction. Eleanor was a pillar of this church, he said, his voice heavy. Her loss is felt deeply. Miss Marple's gentle questions revealed that Eleanor had recently donated a substantial sum for the church roof, a gesture that had silenced rumors about the Prescott family's past. She spoke of making amends, Reed added, then hesitated as if he'd said too much. Miss Marple filed away his unease, sensing he knew more than he let on. Back at Ravenwood Lodge, the atmosphere was subdued, the grandeur of its Georgian halls dimmed by grief. Miss Marple, declining a carriage ride, had walked the half-mile from the village, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel drive. She found the library, a cavernous room with towering bookshelves and a marble fireplace, where Reginald's collection of rare tomes gathered dust. The servants under Inspector Grange's orders have left the room untouched, and Miss Marple took advantage of the quiet to explore. The shelves held volumes on alchemy, medieval art, and local folklore, their spines cracked but meticulously catalogued. A locked cabinet caught her eye, its key missing. Testing the lock with a hairpin, a trick learned from a St. Mary Mead locksmith, she found it empty, save for a faded photograph tucked into a corner. The photograph, dated 1905, showed Reginald Prescott, a stern man with Lawrence's dark eyes, standing beside a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to him. The younger man's identity was unmarked, but the similarity suggested a close relation, perhaps a brother or son. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Lawrence, born years later, couldn't be the man in the photo, yet the resemblance was uncanny. She recalled a St. Mary Mead scandal involving an illegitimate heir, the truth buried until a photograph surfaced. Tucking the photo into her reticule, she continued her search, her fingers brushing a hollow panel on the bookshelf. With a gentle push, it clicked open, revealing a small compartment containing a single sheet of paper list of names, including E. Langley, Eleanor's maiden name, and C. Dunhill, with sums of money beside them. The list in Reginald's hand hinted at debts or payments, but its purpose was unclear. Sylvia Trent's sudden appearance at the library door startled Miss Marple, though she masked it with a serene smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there," Sylvia said, her auburn curls disheveled, her notebook clutched like a shield. "I was just researching. The lodge has such a fascinating history." Her eyes flicked to the open compartment, and Miss Marple, closing it casually, asked about her novel. Sylvia stammered that it was a Gothic tale inspired by Fernley Vale's legends, particularly the Raven's curse tied to the Prescott family. "Eleanor told me a bit about it," she added, too quickly. Miss Marple's gentle probing revealed that Sylvia had spent hours in the library, though she claimed to have found only old stories. The girl's evasiveness, coupled with her keen interest in Reginald's past, raised a flag in Miss Marple's mind. She thought of a St. Mary Mead poet whose research had masked a hunt for buried treasure. As Sylvia excused herself, Miss Marple returned to the drawing room where the other guests were gathered for a tense luncheon. Lawrence sketched absently, his pencil tracing the same raven motif from the letter opener. Clara, sipping sherry, made a barbed remark about wasted legacies, her gaze fixed on Lawrence. Dr. Vaughan, attempting to lighten the mood, shared a medical anecdote, but his hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple, nibbling a cucumber sandwich, observed their dynamics, her thoughts circling back to the photograph in the list. Reginald's disappearance, she mused, was no mere scandal, it was a wound that still bled, infecting the present. That afternoon, Miss Marple slipped into Eleanor's study, where Inspector Grange was reviewing the coroner's report. He shared that Eleanor had no defensive wounds, suggesting she knew her attacker or was taken by surprise. The letter's ink matched a bottle in the study, but its handwriting was distinct from Eleanor's, ruling her out as its author. Miss Marple mentioned the windowsill scratch, prompting Grange to re-examine the bolt, which he conceded was looser than expected. "Still no footprints," he grumbled, but Miss Marple suggested checking for ladder marks or disturbed ivy, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a gardener's tools had betrayed him. Grange, grudgingly impressed, agreed to investigate further. As the day waned, Miss Marple sat by the library's fireplace, her knitting resumed as she pondered the morning's discoveries. The photograph, the list, Sylvia's curiosity, Clara's resentment, they were pieces of a puzzle, each edged with the shadow of Reginald's past. The raven, a recurring symbol, seemed to watch from every corner. In the letter opener, the family crest. She thought of a St. Mary Mead widow whose obsession with the family heirloom had led to betrayal. "The past, Miss Marple," murmured, her needles clicking softly, "has a way of demanding its due." The lodge's secrets were stirring, and she was determined to bring them into the light. Chapter 4. The midnight clue. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Ravenwood Lodge, casting long shadows across the parquet floors as Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm. The household was restless, the air thick with the unspoken weight of Eleanor Prescott's murder. The guests, under Inspector Grange's orders, remained confined to the manor, their alibis scrutinized and their nerves fraying. Miss Marple, outwardly serene, was a silent observer, her sharp blue eyes catching the flicker of unease in Lawrence Prescott's restless pacing, the cold glint in Clara Dunhill's stare, the nervous scribbling of Sylvia Trent, and the forced calm of Dr. Henry Vaughan. The cryptic letter found on Eleanor's desk, the raven's shadow falls at midnight. Truthful outlingered in her mind, its theatrical phrasing a deliberate clue, or perhaps a taunt. Inspector Grange, his mustache bristling with frustration, convened a meeting in the library to share the coroner's final report. The guests gathered reluctantly, their chairs forming a tense semicircle around the fireplace. Grange's voice was gruff as he outlined the facts. Eleanor had died between 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., the single stab wound from the raven-handled letter opener, proving fatal. There were no defensive marks, suggesting she either trusted her attacker or was caught unawares. The weapon bore no fingerprints, wiped clean, and the study's locked door and bolted windows remained a puzzle. Someone in this house knows. More than they're saying, Grange said, his gaze sweeping the room, and that letter-fresh ink written here. Who's playing games? Miss Marple, seated near a bookcase, noted the guests' reactions. Lawrence's clenched jaw, Clara's icy stillness, Sylvia's flushed cheeks, and Dr. Vaughan's averted eyes. Miss Marple requested a closer look at the study, and Grange, respecting her reputation, agreed. The room was as she'd last seen it, the desk cluttered with papers, the inkwell still tipped, the blood stain now a dark rust on the blotter. She circled the space, her sensible shoes silent on the Persian rug, her fingers brushing the bookshelves as if seeking their secrets. The windowsill scratch, noted earlier, drew her attention again. Kneeling with surprising agility for her age, she examined it under a pocket magnifying glass, a trick she'd learned from a St. Mary Mead jeweler. The scratch was fresh, its edges sharp, and a faint smudge of green paint clung to the wood, invisible to the naked eye. She tested the window bolt, confirming its looseness. It could be lifted from outside with a thin tool, allowing entry and exit without breaking the latch. Clever, she murmured, recalling a St. Mary Mead burglary where a loose bolt had fooled the police. Stepping into the garden, Miss Marple examined the ground beneath the study window. The grass, damp from the previous day's mist, showed a subtle indentation, as if a ladder or heavy object had rested there briefly. A tendril of ivy, torn at the base, suggested someone had brushed against it. She summoned Tom Weaver, the lodge's gardener, a wiry man with soil-stained hands and a guarded manner. "Mr. Weaver," she said, her tone gentle but probing, "did you notice anyone near the lodge around midnight?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, his cap twisted in his hands. "Saw a shadow, miss, by the oaks. Couldn't make out who. Thought it was a poacher, maybe." His eyes darted to the window, and Miss Marple sensed he was holding back. She thanked him, filing away his hesitation, reminiscent of St. Mary Mead groundskeeper who'd seen more than he admitted in a theft case. Back inside, Miss Marple sought out Lawrence, finding him in the conservatory, surrounded by his easel and half-finished canvases. His latest painting depicted a stormy sky with a single raven, its wings spread ominously, a motif echoing the letter and the murder weapon. "Lawrence, dear," she said, adjusting her spectacles, "that photograph I found in the library, of your father and another man. Who might he be?" Lawrence's brush paused, his expression tightening. "My father, Reginald, yes. The other man I don't know. A cousin, perhaps. I was a child when he vanished." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Miss Marple pressed gently, mentioning the striking resemblance to him. Lawrence laughed, a touch too sharply. "Family traits, I suppose. Father was always secretive about his past." She nodded, her mind turning to a St. Mary Mead family where a hidden sibling had sparked a feud. Clara Dunhill's presence in the dining room, where she was rearranging silverware with unnecessary precision, offered Miss Marple her next opportunity. "Mrs. Dunhill," she began, her voice disarming, "you seemed troubled by Lawrence's attachment to the lodge last night. Is there history there?" Clara's lips thinned, her hands stilling. "Eleanor indulged him, that's all. This place is a millstone. Selling it would have been sensible. Lawrence's dreams don't pay bills." Her tone was bitter, and Miss Marple caught a glance toward the locked drawer in the sideboard, the same one Eleanor had eyed at dinner. "And the raven imagery?" Miss Marple added casually. "And the letter opener, does it mean anything to you?" Clara scoffed. Old family nonsense. Reginald was obsessed with such symbols. It's nothing. But her fingers tightened on a spoon, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead widow whose denials masked a deeper grudge. Sylvia Trent proved harder to corner, flitting between rooms with her notebook like a nervous bird. Miss Marple found her in the library, sketching the fireplace's intricate carvings. "Miss Trent," she said, settling into a chair, "your novel sounds fascinating. Does it draw on the Prescott family's history?" Sylvia's pen faltered, ink blotching her page. "Only loosely," she said, her voice high. "Eleanor shared some stories about Reginald's manuscripts, the Raven legend. It's just inspiration." Miss Marple smiled, mentioning the letter's poetic tone. "Almost like something a writer might craft," she mused. Sylvia flushed, clutching her notebook. It's not mine." As she hurried away, her shawl caught on a chair and the notebook fell, revealing a sketch of the study's window, complete with the loose bolt. Miss Marple retrieved it, her expression unchanged, but her mind raced, recalling a St. Mary Mead artist whose drawings had betrayed her intentions. That evening, as the guests dined on a subdued meal of cold ham and salad, Inspector Grange shared a new lead. A villager had reported a stranger near the lodge days before Eleanor's death, mailing a letter at the post office. The envelope matched the cryptic letter's style. Miss Marple suggested checking the postmistress's records, her thoughts circling back to Reginald's disappearance. Could he be alive, orchestrating events? Or was the stranger a pawn in a larger game? The guests' reactions to Grange's news were telling. Lawrence's fork paused mid-air, Clara's eyes narrowed, Sylvia's hands shook, and Dr. Vaughn coughed into his napkin. Miss Marple, sipping her water, felt the puzzles. Pieces shifting midnight, the raven, the loose bolt, the stranger. They were connected, she was certain, by the shadows of Ravenwood's past. As the household retired, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her knitting a pretext for reflection. The scratch on the windowsill, Tom's shadowy figure, Sylvia's. Sketch they pointed to a stage-locked room, a deception rooted in motive. She thought of a St. Mary Mead murder where a single clue, a smudged footprint, had unraveled a killer's plan. "The truth," she murmured, her needles clicking softly, "is in the details." The lodge's secrets were whispering, and Miss Marple was listening, ready to follow the raven's trail into the heart of the mystery. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Village. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Fernley Vale, bathing the village in a soft, golden light that belied the grim mood at Ravenwood Lodge. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, slipped out of the manor. Before breakfast, her navy shawl draped over her shoulders and her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The village, with its thatched cottages and bustling market square, offered a chance to gather the kind of unfiltered insights that only idle chatter could provide. She carried her parasol, less for shade than as a prop to encourage conversation, her serene smile inviting confidences. The murder of Eleanor Prescott had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple intended to listen. Knowing that village gossip often held the key to unraveling a mystery, her first stop was the Rose and Crown Tea Shop, a cozy establishment with lace curtains and tables adorned with mismatched china. The proprietress, Mrs. Mabel Turner, greeted her with a warm nod, her apron dusted with flour from morning scones. "Terrible business at the lodge, miss," Mabel said, pouring tea into a rose-patterned cup. Mrs. Prescott was a kind soul, always buying extra buns for the church fete. Miss Marple murmured her sympathies, her eyes scanning the room. A cluster of women at a corner table whispered animatedly, their glances darting toward her. She recognized Mrs. Agnes Booth, the village gossip from the churchyard, and joined her table with a polite request for company. "I do so enjoy a village's stories," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "Fernley Vale seems full of them." Agnes needed little prompting. "Oh, it's a right scandal," she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "That locked room, the Raven letter, it's like something out of a penny dreadful. And to think it's tied to the Prescott's past." She leaned closer, her eyes gleaming. "You know about Reginald Prescott, don't you? Vanished after that manuscript business. Some say he stole it, others that he was framed. Left poor Eleanor to pick up the pieces." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. Agnes revealed that Clara Dunhill, Eleanor's cousin, had never forgiven the family for inheriting Ravenwood Lodge, believing it rightfully hers. "Clara's been sour as a lemon since," Agnes confided. "And that young novelist, Sylvia Trent, poking about for stories, she stirred up old rumors about the Raven's curse." Miss Marple's lips pursed, recalling a St. Mary Mead gossip whose tales had pointed to a hidden heir. The conversation turned to a stranger seen in the village days before Eleanor's death. Miss Eliza Finch, the postmistress, joined the table, her pince-nez glinting as she shared a tidbit. "A man, tall and gray-haired, posted a letter to the lodge last week," she said. "Had a queer way about him, kept his hat low. The envelope was fancy, like the one they found with Mrs. Prescott." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "The cryptic letter, the Raven's shadow falls at midnight. Truth will out had been a pivotal clue, and this stranger might be its author." She asked Eliza to describe the envelope, learning it bore Raven crest, matching the Prescott family seal. Could it have been someone from Eleanor's past? Miss Marple mused, thinking of Reginald's disappearance. Eliza shrugged, but Agnes whispered, "Some swear they've seen Reginald himself, skulking about the moors. A ghost, maybe." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind dismissing ghosts but not the possibility of a living man with a motive. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple strolled to the village green, where children played tag and a blacksmith's hammer rang from a nearby forge. She paused at the post office, a squat building with a red door, and chatted with Eliza Finch behind the counter. Eliza confirmed the stranger's visit, adding that he paid in cash and left no name. "Odd, though," she said, sorting letters. He asked if Ravenwood Lodge was still in Prescott hands, as if he didn't know. Miss Marple thanked. Her thoughts circling back to the photograph of Reginald and the unknown man. A St. Mary Mead postman had once unwittingly delivered a clue in a misaddressed letter. Perhaps Eliza's stranger held a similar key. Back at the lodge, the atmosphere was taut, the guests confined by Inspector Grange's ongoing investigation. Miss Marple found Clara Dunhill in the morning room, sorting through a stack of Eleanor's correspondence with a proprietary air. "Mrs. Dunhill," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, "I heard in the village that you and Eleanor had differing views on the lodge's future." Clara's eyes flashed, but her voice was controlled. Eleanor was sentimental, clinging to this relic. I urged her to sell, to secure the family's finances. She wouldn't listen. Miss Marple noted the edge in her tone, asking about the raven crest on the letter. Clara waved a hand. An old family symbol, nothing more. Reginald was obsessed with it rubbish about curses and secrets. Her dismissal was too quick, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead matron whose denials hid a financial scheme. Seeking Dr. Vaughan, Miss Marple found him in the conservatory, tending to a wilting orchid. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he snipped a leaf. "Dr. Vaughan," she began, her tone gentle, "you mentioned Eleanor's anxiety. Was it tied to the lodge, perhaps?" He hesitated, then admitted she consulted him about a heart condition, exacerbated by stress. "She spoke of a promise she'd made to Reginald," he said, his voice low. "Something about protecting the family's honor. I told her to rest, but she was stubborn." Miss Marple probed about the stranger, but Vaughan shook his head. "I've heard the rumors, but I saw no one." His reluctance to meet her gaze suggested he knew more, much like a St. Mary Mead doctor who'd shielded a patient's secret. Sylvia Trent was in the library, her notebook open to a page of dense notes. Miss Marple, entering quietly, caught her sketching the raven crest from a book on Prescott heraldry. "Miss Trent," she said, "your research seems quite thorough. Have you uncovered anything about the raven's curse?" Sylvia started, closing her notebook. "It's just stories," she said, her voice unsteady. "Eleanor mentioned it once, said it was tied to Reginald's manuscripts. I thought it'd make a good plot." Miss Marple mentioned the stranger, watching Sylvia's reaction. "A stranger?" "I wouldn't know," she stammered, her fingers twisting a curl. As she fled, Miss Marple noticed the letter on the table, half hidden under a book, bearing the same raven crest. It was addressed to Sylvia, unopened, and Miss Marple left it untouched, her suspicions deepening. A St. Mary Mead writer had once used research as a cover for espionage, and Sylvia's behavior echoed that deception. At luncheon, Miss Marple overheard a heated exchange between Clara and Dr. Vaughan in the hall. "You knew about her promise," Clara hissed. "Why didn't you stop her?" Vaughan's reply was muffled, but his tone was defensive. Miss Marple, nibbling a slice of quiche, filed away the moment, sensing a conspiracy rooted in Eleanor's past. Inspector Grange joined the meal, announcing that Tom Weaver, the gardener, had been arrested, his alibi weak and his tools matching the windowsill scratch. Miss Marple, however, doubted his guilt, recalling a St. Mary Mead laborer wrongly accused due to circumstance. "Might we consider the stranger?" she suggested to Grange, who grunted but agreed to check Eliza's records. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple sat in her guest room, her knitting a pretext for reflection. The village whispers, the raven crested. Letter, Clara's bitterness, Sylvia's secrecy, Vaughan's reticence, they were threads in a tangled web. The stranger's presence, tied to the Prescott seal, suggested an outsider with intimate knowledge of the family. She thought of a St. Mary Mead mystery where a long-lost relative had returned to claim a legacy, leaving chaos in their wake. "The past," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly, "is never truly buried." The lodge's secrets were stirring, and she was ready to unearth them, one whisper at a time. Chapter 6. The Raven's Secret. The afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of Ravenwood Lodge, casting intricate patterns on the oak-paneled walls of the library where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The house was hushed, the guests subdued under the weight of Eleanor Prescott's murder and Inspector Grange's relentless investigation. The cryptic letter found on her desk, "The raven's shadow falls at midnight. Truth will out," had become a haunting refrain, its words echoing in Miss Marple's mind as she pieced together the puzzle of Fernley Vale. The village gossip, the stranger at the post office, the loose window bolt, and the raven motif were threads in a tapestry of secrets, and she sensed they converged on the Prescott family's shadowed past. Today she resolved to delve deeper into that past, starting with the legacy of Reginald Prescott. Miss Marple returned to the library, where Reginald's collection of rare manuscripts and dusty tomes offered a window into his obsessions. The room was a scholar's haven, with high shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes, a brass telescope by the window, and a massive desk cluttered with faded maps and quill pens. She had already uncovered a photograph and a mysterious list in a hidden compartment, but the locked cabinet she'd noticed earlier beckoned. With no key in sight, she employed her hairpin trick again, the lock yielding with a soft click. Inside, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, their wax seals bearing the raven crest. The letters, addressed to Reginald from an unknown correspondent, spoke of the Codex Ravenous, a medieval manuscript rumored to contain alchemical secrets. One letter, dated 1904, warned, "The Codex is our burden and our salvation. Guard it, or the raven's curse will fall." Miss Marple's lips pursed, recalling a St. Mary Mead antiquarian whose obsession with a rare book had led to betrayal. The library's silence was broken by the creak of the door, and Lawrence Prescott entered, his artist's smock flecked with paint. His dark eyes, so like Reginald's in the photograph, widened at the sight of Miss Marple with the letters. "Miss Marple, you're thorough," he said, a wry smile masking his unease. She invited him to sit, her tone gentle but probing. "Lawrence, dear, these letters mention a Codex Ravenous. Did Eleanor ever speak of it?" Lawrence hesitated, then nodded. "It's a family legend, half myth. Father believed it was hidden in the lodge, worth a fortune or a curse, depending on who you ask." Eleanor thought it nonsense, but she kept his papers out of duty. His fingers traced the raven crest on a letter, and Miss Marple noted his wistful expression, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead heir haunted by his lineage. She showed him the photograph of Reginald with the unknown man, pressing for details. Lawrence's brow furrowed. "I've seen it before in Father's things. He never named the man, said it was a private matter. Could be a friend from his collecting days." His voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple suspected he knew more. Much like a St. Mary Mead youth who'd concealed a family scandal. She shifted tack, asking about the raven's curse mentioned in the village. Lawrence laughed softly. "A tale to scare children. The Prescotts were said to be cursed for hiding the Codex, bringing misfortune. Father was fascinated, but I never believed it." Yet his paintings, with their recurring raven motifs, suggested a deeper connection, and Miss Marple filed away the contradiction. Clara Dunhill's sharp voice interrupted as she entered the library, her black dress rustling. "Lawrence, wasting time with fairy tales?" She snapped, her eyes narrowing at the letters. Miss Marple, unfazed, invited her to join them, mentioning the Codex. Clara's lips thinned. Eleanor was fool enough to entertain Reginald's delusions. She planned to sell the lodge to fund some wild search for that myth. I told her it was madness, our inheritance squandered on a ghost. Her bitterness was palpable, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead widow whose resentment over a lost legacy had fueled deceit. And the raven letter, Miss Marple added casually, could it be tied to the Codex? Clara scoffed. "A prank or Sylvia's nonsense. She's always scribbling such drivel." But her glance at the letters was hungry, and Miss Marple sensed she coveted more than the lodge. Sylvia Trent's arrival, her notebook clutched tightly, added another layer of tension. She froze at the sight of the letters, her auburn curls escaping their pens. "Oh, I didn't mean to intrude," she stammered, but her eyes locked on the Codex references. Miss Marple, with her disarming smile, asked about her research. "Miss Trent, you mentioned the raven's curse. Did Eleanor share anything about the Codex Ravenous?" Sylvia's flush deepened. "Only bits said it was a legend Reginald chased. I thought it'd make a gripping story." Her voice was too eager, and Miss Marple noticed her notebook's edge, where a sketch of the raven crest peeked out. A St. Mary Mead writer had once hidden clues in her poetry. and Sylvia's obsession with the codex felt similarly purposeful. Miss Marple excused herself to explore the lodge's attic, where Grayson, the butler, had mentioned old trunks of Reginald's belongings. The attic was a labyrinth of cobwebs and forgotten relics, chipped china, moth-eaten gowns, and a steamer trunk bearing Reginald's initials. Inside, she found his journals, their pages yellowed but legible. One entry, dated 1905, described the codex in fervent, its location a secret entrusted to a trusted soul. A coded passage hinted at a hiding place within the lodge, marked by the raven's gaze. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The codex was real, and its value financial, or symbolic was motive enough for murder. She tucked the journal under her shawl, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a coded diary had revealed a thief's plan. Returning downstairs, Miss Marple sought Dr. Vaughn, finding him in his room, organizing his medical bag. "Dr. Vaughn," she began, "you treated Reginald years ago. Was he troubled by the codex rumors?" Vaughn's hand stilled, his spectacles fogging slightly. "He was unstable," he admitted. "Obsessed with that manuscript, claimed it held secrets worth killing for. I prescribed sedatives, but he vanished soon after." His reluctance to elaborate mirrored a St. Mary Mead doctor who'd concealed a patient's madness. Miss Marple mentioned the journal's code, watching his reaction. "Reginald was fanciful," he said, too quickly. Eleanor dismissed it as folly. His avoidance of the codex's specifics deepened her suspicions. At dinner, the guests' tension surfaced. Clara accused Lawrence of clinging to myths like his father, while Sylvia's questions about the lodge's history felt rehearsed. Miss Marple, nibbling her soup, observed their interplay, her thoughts on the codex's allure. The journal, the letters, Sylvia's sketches, they pointed to a treasure hunt turned deadly. She thought of a St. Mary Mead merchant whose greed for a hidden relic had led to violence. "The Raven's secret," she murmured, her needles pausing, "is no myth." As the meal ended, she resolved to decode the journal's cipher, certain. It held the key to Eleanor's killer and the shadow that still haunted Ravenwood Lodge. Chapter 7. A crack in the alibi. The morning air at Ravenwood Lodge carried a crisp edge, the scent of dew-soaked grass mingling with the faint smoke of the village chimneys. Miss Jane Marple sat by her guest room window, her knitting needles idle. As she gazed at the rolling hills of Fernley Vale, the investigation into Eleanor Prescott's murder had reached a tense impasse, with Inspector Grange's suspicions circling the household like a hawk. The cryptic letter, "The Raven's Shadow," falls at midnight. Truth will out, and the locked study remained a puzzle. But Miss Marple's discoveries, the codex ravenous, Reginald's journals, the loose window bolt were knitting together a pattern of greed and betrayal. Today, she resolved to test the guests' alibis, sensing that a single crack could unravel the killer's carefully woven deception. Miss Marple began with Clara Dunhill, whose sharp tongue and resentment toward Eleanor had marked her as a person of interest. She found Clara in the morning room, sorting through a pile of estate papers with a proprietary air. "Mrs. Dunhill," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze, "I've been thinking about the night of the murder. You mentioned being in your room, reading. Could you walk me through your evening?" Clara's eyes narrowed, but she complied, her voice clipped. "I dined with the others, retired at 10, and read until midnight. Trollop, if you must know. Then I slept." Miss Marple nodded, her serene smile masking her intent. "And you? Heard nothing? No footsteps, perhaps, in the hall?" Clara's lips thinned. "Nothing." The house was quiet. To test her story, Miss Marple suggested a walk through the east wing, where Clara's room was located. The corridor, lined with portraits and creaky oak floorboards, was a stage for her experiment. She asked Clara to retrace her steps from the dining room to her bedroom, observing closely. As they passed the study, a floorboard groaned under Clara's weight, its sound sharp in the silent hall. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The noise was distinctive, one she'd heard faintly the night of the murder when fetching a shawl. Curious, she mused aloud, how old houses betray movement. This board, for instance, quite loud. Clara's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened on her sleeve. I didn't leave my room, she insisted. Miss Marple smiled, recalling a St. Mary Mead widow whose alibi crumbled under similar scrutiny, her nocturnal wanderings betrayed by a squeaky stair. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Inspector Grange reviewing notes. She shared her observation about the floorboard, suggesting Clara may have been near the study at midnight. Grange, his mustache twitching, was skeptical but agreed to confront her. In the library, with Miss Marple present, Clara faced questioning. Mrs. Dunhill, Grange began, we've reason to believe you were in the East Wing corridor near the time of the murder. Care to explain? Clara's composure faltered, her voice sharp. I did visit Eleanor earlier, around 10, to discuss selling the lodge. She was stubborn, as usual. But I was in my room by 11. Her admission placed her closer to the crime scene, and Miss Marple noted her flushed cheeks, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead matron caught in a half-truth. Miss Marple next sought Lawrence Prescott, whose vague alibi and connection to the codex made him a puzzle. She found him in the conservatory, sketching a raven in charcoal, its wings dark against a stormy sky. Lawrence, dear, she said, settling beside him, you mentioned being in your room, sketching, the night Eleanor died. Did you hear anything unusual? Lawrence's pencil paused, his dark eyes troubled. Nothing, Miss Marple. I was lost and my work time slips away when I draw. She asked about the codex, probing his knowledge of Reginald's obsession. Father's stories were fanciful, he said, his voice low. Eleanor warned me not to chase myths, but I always wondered if the codex was real. His paintings with their raven motifs suggested a deeper fixation, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead artist whose work had revealed his guilt dot to test Lawrence's alibi. Miss Marple asked him to show her his sketches from that night. He hesitated, then produced a notebook filled with studies of clouds and birds, dated the evening of the murder. The drawings were detailed, but one page bore a faint smudge of green paint, matching the trace on the study's windowsill. Curious, Miss Marple said, her tone light. This paint, where might it be from? Lawrence flushed, claiming it was from his palette, but his unease was palpable. Miss Marple filed away the clue, thinking of a St. Mary Mead youth whose stained hands had betrayed a theft. Sylvia Trent was next, her nervous energy making her a slippery subject. Miss Marple found her in the garden, sketching the lodge's facade. Her notebook opened to a detailed rendering of the study window. Miss Trent, Miss Marple began, your alibi places you in the library until 11. Did you notice anyone? In the East Wing? Sylvia's pen faltered, ink blotching her page. No, I was writing, lost in my story, she said, her voice high. Miss Marple mentioned the floorboards creak, watching her reaction. I didn't hear anything, Sylvia stammered, her fingers twisting a curl. Her notebook glimpsed. Earlier contained sketches of the lodge's layout, including the study's bolt, and Miss Marple suspected her research was a cover. A St. Mary Mead writer had once used her journal to plan a deception, and Sylvia's behavior echoed that cunning Miss Marple visited St. Cuthbert's Church that afternoon, seeking the vicar, Mr. Timothy Reed, whose sermon had hinted at hidden truths. The church was quiet, its stained glass windows casting jewel-like patterns on the stone floor. Reed, polishing the altar, greeted her warmly but warily. Mr. Reed, she said, Eleanor's generosity to the church was remarkable. Did she ever speak of the codex or her husband's past? Reed's tick returned, his cloth pausing. She mentioned a burden, yes, tied to Reginald's mistakes. Said she was atoning for them. Pressed further, he revealed a church register entry from 1906, recording the baptism of a child born to an unknown Prescott relative with Eleanor's godmother. No name was given, he said, but Eleanor seemed protective of the record. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The child could be the man in the photograph, a hidden heir tied to the codex. A St. Mary Mead baptism had once uncovered a family secret, and this felt eerily similar dot back at the lodge. Miss Marple caught Sylvia sketching the church spire from the garden. Her notebook opened to a page with the baptism date scrawled in the margin. "Miss Trent, you're quite the historian," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. Sylvia flushed, slamming her notebook shut. "Just notes for my novel?" she muttered, hurrying away. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. Sylvia's knowledge of the baptism suggested she was more than a curious novelist, perhaps a descendant seeking the codex's legacy. The day closed with a tense dinner, where Clara's barbs at Lawrence grew sharper, and Sylvia's silence was punctuated by nervous glances. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, felt the alibis cracking, each guest story fraying under scrutiny. She thought of a St. Mary Mead murder where a single lie had unraveled a killer's plan. "The truth," she murmured, her needles clicking, "softly is closer than they think." Tomorrow she would press harder, following the Raven's trail to its source. Chapter 8. The Hidden Passage. The morning at Ravenwood Lodge dawned with a restless energy. The sky over Fernley Vale streaked with clouds that mirrored the unease within the manor's walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her, knitting, felt the threads of Eleanor Prescott's murder tightening into a discernible pattern. The cryptic letter, the codex ravenous, the loose window bolt, and the fractured alibis were pieces of a puzzle, and the discovery of a possible hidden error in the church register had deepened her suspicions. The raven motif etched in the letter, the murder weapon, and the family crest seemed to point to a secret buried in the lodge itself. Today, Miss Marple resolved to explore the study once more, certain that its locked-room mystery held the key to the killer's method, if not their motive. After a quiet breakfast, where the guests exchanged strained pleasantries under Inspector Grange's watchful eye, Miss Marple slipped into the east wing. The study, still cordoned off, was a silent witness to the crime, its air heavy with the scent of old books and dried blood. She moved with purpose, her sensible shoes silent on the rug, her eyes scanning the walls for anomalies. The windowsill, scratch and loose bolt had already suggested an outside entry, but the absence of footprints in the garden had puzzled Grange. Miss Marple, however, suspected a more ingenious solution. She tapped the oak-paneled walls, her knuckles producing a dull thud until, behind a bookcase filled with Reginald's tomes, she heard a hollow echo. Her fingers traced the shelf's edge, finding a subtle catch disguised as a knot in the wood. With a gentle press, the bookcase shifted, revealing a narrow passage. Its stone walls damp and cloaked in cobwebs. Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint smile of satisfaction crossing her face. "How very like St. Mary Mead," she murmured, recalling a vicarage where a hidden passage had concealed a smuggler's cache. The passage was cramped, barely wide enough for one person, and sloped downward, its exit hidden by a wooden panel in the garden shed. She stepped carefully, her handkerchief pressed to her nose against the musty air, and found a scrap of fabric caught on a splinter gray wool, matching Clara Dunhill's shawl. At the shed's exit, she noted scuff marks in the dirt, suggesting recent use, and the faint trace of green paint on the panel, echoing the smudge on the windowsill and Lawrence's sketchbook. The passage explained the locked room. The killer had entered and exited unseen, locking the door from inside to stage a mystery. Returning to the study, Miss Marple summoned Inspector Grange, who examined the passage with a mix of awe and frustration. Blasted old houses, he muttered, crawling through the cramped space. This changes everything. He ordered a constable to dust the passage for fingerprints, though the stone walls were unlikely to yield clear prints. Miss Marple suggested checking the shed for tools, a knife, or crowbar that might have loosened the window bolt as a diversion. Grange, warming to her insight, agreed, though he grumbled about amateur sleuths. Miss Marple smiled, thinking of a St. Mary Mead constable who'd learned to value her meddling in a theft case. She sought Clara first, finding her in the morning room, her face pale as she read a letter. "Mrs. Dunhill," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle, "we found a passage leading from the study to the garden. A scrap of your shawl was caught inside. Might you explain?" Clara's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly. "I explored the lodge days ago, out of curiosity. Old houses have such quirks. I must have brushed against something." Her voice was steady, but her fingers crumpled the letter, and Miss Marple noted the lie, recalling a St. Mary Mead widow whose excuses had masked a burglary. "And the night of the murder?" Miss Marple pressed. Clara insisted she was in her room, her alibi unchanged, but the creaky floorboard from the previous day suggested otherwise. Lawrence was next, sketching in the conservatory, his canvas now a chaotic swirl of ravens and storm clouds. Miss Marple mentioned the passage, watching his reaction. "I knew it as a boy," he admitted, his charcoal snapping in his grip. "Used to sneak out for midnight adventures. But I haven't been in it for years." His paintings, however, depicted the passage's entrance, a shadowed arch behind a bookcase, suggesting recent familiarity. Miss Marple showed him the green paint smudge, asking about his sketchbook. "From my palette," he said, too quickly, his eyes darting away. She recalled a St. Mary Mead artist whose drawings had betrayed his presence at a crime scene, and Lawrence's unease deepened her suspicions. Sylvia Trent proved elusive, but Miss Marple caught her in the library, her notebook open to a sketch of the study's bookcase, the passage's entrance marked with uncanny precision. "Miss Trent," Miss Marple said, settling beside her, "this passage is quite a find. Your sketches are remarkably detailed. Did you know of it?" Sylvia's pen froze, ink blotching her page. I guessed it might exist," she stammered. "Old manners often have secret ways." "It's for my novel." Her notebook, however, omitted the passage and other drawings, a deliberate exclusion. That struck Miss Marple as calculated. A St. Mary Mead writer had once used her journal to mislead, and Sylvia's secrecy mirrored that deception. Miss Marple found Dr. Vaughn in his room, his medical bag open on the desk. A vial of sedative caught her eye, its label faded but legible. "Dr. Vaughn," she said, "this passage could have allowed someone to enter the study unnoticed. Might Eleanor have been sedated to ensure no struggle?" Vaughn's spectacles slipped, his hands trembling. "I prescribed her a mild sedative for anxiety," he admitted. "But the coroner found no trace in her system." His defensiveness echoed a St. Mary Mead doctor who'd concealed a patient's overdose, and Miss Marple wondered if Vaughn's loyalty to Eleanor hid a darker truth down at luncheon. The guests' tensions boiled over. Clara accused Lawrence of sneaking about like a thief, while Sylvia's silence was punctuated by nervous glances at her notebook. Grange announced the passage's discovery, watching for reactions. Lawrence's jaw tightened, Clara's eyes flashed, Sylvia's hands shook, and Vaughn coughed into his napkin. Miss Marple, nibbling a scone, felt the web of deceit tightening. The passage, the paint, the sedative, they pointed to a conspiracy with the Codex as its prize. She thought of a St. Mary Mead murder where a hidden door had revealed a killer's path. "The raven's shadow," she murmured, her needles clicking softly, "is cast by many hands." Tomorrow she would follow the passage's clues, certain they led to the heart of Ravenwood's secrets. Chapter 9. The stranger's shadow, the evening at Ravenwood Lodge, settled over Fernley Vale like a velvet curtain, the sky deepening to indigo as stars began to prick through the clouds. Miss Jane Marple sat by the drawing-room fire, her knitting, needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her mind was far from the soft wool in her lap. The discovery of the hidden passage had shattered the illusion of the locked-room murder, pointing to a calculated deception rooted in the Prescott family's past. The Codex Ravenous, Reginald's obsession, loomed as the motive, its promise, of wealth or secrets driving someone to kill Eleanor Prescott. The cryptic letter, the raven motifs, the loose alibis, and now the village whispers of a stranger with a raven crested envelope, all were threads in a tapestry Miss Marple was weaving with care. Tonight she aimed to trace the stranger's shadow. Sensing it led to the heart of the mystery, Miss Marple began her day with a visit to the village post office, where Miss Eliza Finch, the postmistress, was sorting letters behind her red-countered desk. The air smelled of ink and wax, and a brass bell jingled as Miss Marple entered. "Miss Finch," she said, her tone warm but purposeful, "you mentioned a stranger mailing a letter to the lodge last week. Could you describe him again?" Eliza adjusted her pince-nez, her memory sharp. Tall, gray-haired, maybe 60. Wore a dark coat and kept his hat low, like he didn't want to be seen. The envelope had that raven crest, same as the Prescotts. Use. She added that he'd asked about the lodge's ownership, his voice clipped but cultured. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The description echoed Reginald Prescott, vanished but perhaps not gone. She recalled a St. Mary Mead stranger whose letters had stirred a dormant feud, and this man's actions felt similarly deliberate. Eliza, warming to the conversation, revealed a new detail. The stranger had lingered in the village, seen at the Rose and Crown Inn 2 days before Eleanor's death. Miss Marple thanked her and crossed the cobbled square to the inn, a timber-bird building with a creaking sign. The innkeeper, Mr. Josiah Hash, a jovial man with a ruddy face, confirmed the stranger's stay. Booked a room under the name John. "Raven," he said, wiping a glass. "Quiet sort, paid in cash." Asked about the Prescotts, said he had old business with them. He showed Miss Marple the guest register where John Raven was scrawled in a hand that matched the cryptic. Letters flourish. The alias tied to the raven motif struck Miss Marple as no coincidence, and she thought of a St. Mary Mead imposter who'd used a false name to reclaim a legacy. Back at the lodge, Miss Marple shared her findings with Inspector Grange, who was overseeing a search of the garden shed for tools linked to the passage. Grange's mustache twitched as he noted the alias. "John Raven, eh? Sounds like a taunt. If it's Reginald Prescott, he's got nerve showing his face." He dispatched a constable to check neighboring villages for sightings, while Miss Marple suggested examining the lodge's cellar, where old family records might hide clues to Reginald's fate. Grayson, the butler, led them to the damp, stone-walled cellar, its shelves lined with crates and wine bottles. Amid the dust, Miss Marple found a locked box bearing Reginald's initials, its hinges rusted but intact. Grange pried it open, revealing a faded map of the estate, marked with a raven symbol near the lodge's chapel. An unused structure in the grounds thought the map's significance was immediate, and Miss Marple, with Grange's permission, led a small party to the chapel, a Gothic relic overgrown with ivy. Its oak door groaned as they entered, the air inside cool and heavy with the scent of mildew. Stained glass windows cast fractured light on a stone altar, and Miss Marple's fingers traced its edges, finding a hollow panel. With Grange's help, she slid it open, revealing a cavity empty, save for a scrap of parchment with the words, "The Raven guards its own." Her lips pursed. The codex had been here, but someone had claimed it first. Sylvia Trent, who had followed uninvited, gasped softly, her notebook clutched tightly. "Research for your novel, Miss Trent?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild but Probing, Sylvia stammered, I heard the chapel was historic. Just curious. Her eyes lingered on the altar, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead scholar whose curiosity had masked a treasure hunt. Returning to the lodge, Miss Marple sought Lawrence Prescott, finding him in the library, his latest painting a chaotic swirl of ravens and shadows. "Lawrence, dear," she said, "this map and the name John Raven, do they stir any memories?" Lawrence's brush paused, his face pale. "Father used to sketch that chapel, said it held family secrets. I thought it was his madness talking." He denied knowing John Raven, but his voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted his clenched fists, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead heir haunted by his father's sins. She mentioned the empty altar, watching his reaction. "Empty?" He echoed, his eyes flickering. "Then the codex is gone or never was." His relief seemed forced, and Miss Marple suspected he knew more. Clara Dunhill, encountered in the drawing room, was less forthcoming. "John Raven?" "Another of Reginald's follies, no doubt," she snapped, her black dress stark against her pale skin. Miss Marple mentioned the chapel's hollow altar, probing for a reaction. "Eleanor was foolish to chase such myths, Clara." Sad, her voice cold. "The codex is a fantasy, and this lodge is a curse." Her bitterness echoed the village gossip about her resentment, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead widow whose greed had driven her to deceit. Clara's glance at the locked drawer in the sideboard, a recurring fixation, deepened Miss Marple's suspicions of her motives. Sylvia's behavior grew more erratic, her notebook now a constant shield. Miss Marple caught her in the garden, sketching the chapel's spire with feverish intensity. "Miss Trent, your interest in the Prescotts is remarkable," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "This John Raven, could he be tied to your research?" Sylvia's pen snapped, ink staining her fingers. "I don't know him," she cried, her voice shrill. "I'm just writing a story." Her notebook, glimpsed briefly, contained a sketch of the altar's cavity, suggesting prior knowledge. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead writer whose fiction had concealed a real plot, and Sylvia's desperation felt similarly incriminating. At dinner, the guests' tensions flared. Clara accused Sylvia of stirring trouble with her questions, while Lawrence's silence was heavy with unspoken fears. Dr. Vaughan, attempting to mediate, mentioned Eleanor's burden, but his hands trembled, hinting at withheld truths. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, felt the stranger's shadow looming larger. The map, the empty altar, the alias, they pointed to Reginald, or as someone claiming his legacy, orchestrating events. She thought of a St. Mary Mead mystery where a returned exile had sparked chaos. "The raven's gaze," she murmured, her needles clicking softly, watches still. Tomorrow, she would decode the parchment's clue, certain it would lead her to the killer's doorstep. Chapter 10. The codex revealed the morning at Ravenwood Lodge broke with a restless clarity, the sun piercing the clouds over Fernley Vale to bathe the manor in a crisp golden light. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, her knitting needles paused. As she studied Reginald Prescott's journal, its coded passage about the Codex Ravenous burning in her mind. The hidden passage, the stranger named John Raven, and the empty altar in the chapel had tightened the web of Eleanor Prescott's murder, pointing to a motive rooted in the elusive manuscript. The cryptic letter, "The Raven's shadow falls." At midnight, truth will out had been a taunt, and Miss Marple sensed the killer's identity was close to surfacing. Today she resolved to confront the household, using the codex as a lure to draw out the truth. Miss Marple began by decoding the journal cipher, a task she approached with the patience of a St. Mary Mead puzzle solver. The coded entry marked, "By the Raven's gaze," used a substitution cipher, its key hidden in a poem Reginald had scribbled elsewhere. Beneath the watcher's eye, truth lies. Cross-referencing the poem's letters with the cipher, she unraveled a message. The codex rests where the raven stands, in the garden's heart. Her eyes gleamed. The garden held a stone statue of a raven, perched on an oak stump, its gaze fixed. On the lodge, she recalled a St. Mary Mead case where a garden ornament had concealed a stolen gem, and this statue promised a similar revelation. She summoned Inspector Grange to the drawing room, where the guests were gathered, their faces taut with suspicion. Lawrence Prescott sketched absently, his raven motifs more frenzied. Clara Dunhill sat rigid, her black dress a stark contrast to her pale fury. Sylvia Trent clutched her notebook, her auburn curls disheveled, and Dr. Henry Vaughan fidgeted with his spectacles, his calm fraying. Grange, his mustache bristling, stood by the fireplace as Miss Marple began, her voice serene but commanding. "We've uncovered much about Eleanor's death," she said, holding up the journal. "The codex. Ravenous, Reginald's obsession, is no myth. It's hidden here, and its promise drove someone to murder." She recounted the clues, the hidden passage explaining the locked room, the green paint linking the windowsill to Lawrence's sketchbook, the scrap of Claire's shawl in the passage, Sylvia's sketches of the study and chapel, and the stranger, John Raven, whose letter matched the murder's taunt. "The codex," she continued, "was concealed in the chapel, but moved recently, likely by the killer. Reginald's cipher points to the raven statue in the garden." The guests' reactions were telling. Lawrence's pencil snapped, Clara's lips thinned, Sylvia's hands shook, and Vaughan's cough was sharp. Miss Marple watched them, recalling a St. Mary Mead confrontation where a single flinch had betrayed a thief. Grange led the group to the garden, where the raven statue stood, its stone eyes glinting in the sunlight. The ground beneath was undisturbed, but Miss Marple pointed to a faint seam in the oak stump's base, disguised as a natural crack. Grange, with a constable's help, pried it open, revealing a hollow chamber. Inside was a locked chest, its iron bands rusted but intact, bearing the Prescott raven crest. The guests gasped, their eyes fixed on the prize. Grange forced the lock, lifting the lid to reveal the Codex Ravenous, a brittle manuscript, its vellum, pages inscribed with alchemical symbols and Latin text, illuminated by a raven in gold leaf. "Worth a fortune," Grange muttered, "or a curse." Clara broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Eleanor planned to sell the lodge for this?" "Folly. I searched for it, yes, to protect our inheritance." Her admission confirmed her presence in the passage, but Miss Marple sensed she was no killer, merely greedy, like a St. Mary Mead matron who'd coveted a neighbor's heirloom. Lawrence, his face pale, whispered, "I thought it was a myth." "Father's madness." His paintings, however, had depicted the statue, suggesting subconscious knowledge, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead artist whose work had revealed his guilt. Sylvia's reaction was explosive. She lunged for the chest, her notebook falling as she cried, "It's mine, my birthright." Grange restrained her, and Miss Marple retrieved the notebook, its pages spilling open to reveal a family tree tracing Sylvia to Reginald Prescott, his granddaughter, born out of wedlock to a woman named Margaret Trent, the sketches, the baptism note. The raven-crested letter to Sylvia all pointed to her obsession with claiming the codex. "You wrote the cryptic letter?" Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "To pressure Eleanor into revealing the codex's location, didn't." "You?" Sylvia's eyes blazed, her voice a sob. "She refused to acknowledge me. I'm a Prescott, but she kept it from me." Miss Marple pieced it together for Grange and the stunned guests. Sylvia, discovering her lineage, had researched the codex, believing it her due. The stranger, John Raven, was likely a Confederate, perhaps a distant relative or hired agent sent to mail the letter and scout the lodge. Sylvia's sketches mapped the passage and chapel, showing her planning. But murder, Miss Marple said, was not your intent, was it? Sylvia's silence was damning, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead outcast whose desperation for acceptance had turned violent. Grange, holding the codex, demanded answers. Sylvia's defiance crumbled, but she stopped short of confession, her eyes darting to the lodge. Miss Marple noted Dr. Vaughan's pallor, his hands trembling as he muttered about Eleanor's burden. Clara's anger flared, accusing Sylvia of tainting the family name, while Lawrence's grief seemed genuine, his dreams of the lodge untainted by greed. The codex, now in Grange's custody, was a silent witness to their unraveling, its pages whispering of secrets too heavy to bear. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead relic that had sparked a feud, its value less than the lives it cost Dot as the guests returned to the lodge. Miss Marple lingered by the statue, her knitting resumed in the garden's quiet. The codex was found, but the killer's full confession remained elusive. Sylvia's outburst, the stranger's role, the passages. Used they were nearly complete, but a final thread awaited. She recalled a St. Mary Mead case where a treasure's discovery had forced a murderer's hand. The Raven's truth, she murmured, her needles clicking softly, is almost out. Tomorrow she would press Sylvia further, certain the lodge's shadows would yield their last secret. Chapter 11. The motive unraveled, the late afternoon light bathed Ravenwood Lodge in a soft amber glow, softening the stark lines of its Georgian facade as the weight of Eleanor. Prescott's murder pressed heavily on its inhabitants. Miss Jane. Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with a quiet rhythm, though her mind was a whirl of connections. The discovery of the codex ravenous beneath the Raven statue had shattered the household's fragile composure, and Sylvia. Trent's outbursts, claiming the manuscript as her birthright, had laid bare her connection to Reginald Prescott. The cryptic letter, the hidden passage, the stranger named John Raven, and the codex itself were pieces of a puzzle now falling into place. Miss Marple knew the time had come to unravel the motive fully, to draw out the confession that would close the case. With Inspector Grange's approval, she prepared to confront Sylvia, sensing the young novelist's desperation held the key to the truth. Miss Marple requested a private meeting in the library, where the codex now rested under Grange's guard, its vellum pages locked in a police case. Sylvia entered reluctantly, her auburn curls disheveled, her notebook abandoned, her eyes red from crying. Grange stood by the fireplace, his mustache bristling with authority, while Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her serene demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "Miss Trent," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but unwavering, "you've admitted to writing the cryptic letter, to pressuring Eleanor about the codex. But there's more, isn't there? The passage, the murder tell us the truth." Sylvia's hands twisted in her lap, her defiance crumbling under Miss Marple's steady gaze. Reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead girl caught in a lie, Sylvia's confession came in halting bursts, her voice a mix of shame and fury. "I am Reginald's granddaughter," she said, her chin trembling. "My mother, Margaret Trent, was his secret child, born to a seamstress he loved but never acknowledged. I found her letters last year, hid in a trunk, telling of the codex his legacy meant for his heirs. I came to Fernley Vale to claim it, to prove I was a Prescott." She admitted researching the lodge, befriending Eleanor under the guise of a novelist, and discovering the hidden passage while exploring. The cryptic letter, mailed by a hired courier she'd met through her research contacts, was meant to unnerve Eleanor, to force her to reveal the codex's location. "I signed it John Raven, a name from grandfather's journals, to make it seem like an outsider's threat," she said, her voice breaking. Miss Marple nodded, her needles paused, her mind tracing Sylvia's path. "And the night of the murder," she prompted, her tone soft but insistent. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. I used the passage, yes, to sneak into the study. I confronted Eleanor at midnight, begging her to tell me where the codex was. She refused. She said it was a curse, that it would ruin me. I was so angry. I grabbed the letter opener. It was a moment of madness. I didn't mean to kill her. Her sobs echoed in the library, and Grange's expression hardened, his notebook open. Miss Marple, however, saw the truth in Sylvia's anguish, recalling a St. Mary Mead outcast whose desperation for belonging had led to violence. Miss Marple pressed further, her voice steady. You locked the door from inside, didn't you? To make it seem impossible? Sylvia nodded, wiping her eyes. I panicked. I wiped the letter opener, left the letter to confuse things, and slipped back through the passage. I thought the locked room would point to someone else. Her sketches, Miss Marple noted, had mapped the passage and study, showing premeditation, though the murder itself seemed impulsive. The green paint on the windowsill, likely from a tool Sylvia used to test the bolt as a backup plan, had been a misstep, linking to Lawrence's sketchbook by chance. And John Raven? Miss Marple asked. Sylvia admitted the courier was a drifter, paid to mail the letter and ask questions in the village, unaware of her full intent. He's gone now, back to London, she said, her voice hollow. Grange, satisfied with the confession, called for a constable to take Sylvia into custody. As she was led away, her shoulders slumped. Miss Marple felt a pang of pity, tempered by the weight of justice. She turned to the other guests, summoned to the drawing room to hear the resolution. Clara Dunhill, her face pale, admitted to knowing of Sylvia's lineage through old family letters, but staying silent, hoping to secure the codex for herself. I searched the lodge, used the passage once, but I didn't kill her, she said, her voice bitter. Miss Marple believed her, seeing in Clara a St. Mary Mead matron driven by greed, not violence. Lawrence Prescott, his eyes red with grief, was cleared of suspicion. His paintings, filled with ravens in the passage, reflected childhood memories and subconscious fears, not guilt. I loved Aunt Eleanor, he said, his voice breaking. I only wanted to keep the lodge, to honor her. Miss Marple nodded, recalling a St. Mary Mead artist whose work had expressed sorrow, not crime. Dr. Vaughan, his hands steady at last, confessed to prescribing Eleanor's sedatives, but insisted they were unrelated to her death. The coroner's report, Miss Marple noted, supported this, and Vaughan's reticence stemmed from loyalty. Much like a St. Mary Mead doctor protecting a patient's secrets, Miss Marple addressed the group, her voice calm but resonant. Sylvia's motive was rooted in the need to belong, to claim a legacy denied her. The codex, real and valuable, was her obsession, but it was Eleanor's refusal that sparked her rage. The passage, the letter, the locked room, they were young. Woman's attempt to outwit us, but human nature leaves traces. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case where a spurned heir had lashed out, their plan undone by a single clue. The codex, now destined for a museum per Eleanor's will, was a silent witness to the tragedy. Its secrets no longer worth killing for. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her knitting resumed. Sylvia's confession had closed the case, but the lodge's shadows lingered, a reminder of the past's long reach. Grange, joining her, admitted his initial skepticism. You've a knack, Miss Marple, he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. That passage, the cipher, you saw what I missed? She smiled, her needles clicking softly. People are much the same, Inspector, whether in St. Mary Mead or Fernley Vale. They hide, but they always reveal. The raven's shadow had lifted, but Miss Marple knew human nature would cast others, and she was ready for them. Chapter 12. The village heals. The morning sun rose over Fernley Vale with a gentle warmth. its rays filtering through the ancient oaks surrounding Ravenwood Lodge and casting dappled patterns on the village's cobbled streets. The air was alive, with the scent of blooming honeysuckle and the distant clatter of market stalls, a stark contrast to the heavy pall that had lingered since Eleanor Prescott's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a garden bench with her knitting, felt a quiet satisfaction as the lodge's secrets were laid bare. Sylvia Trent's confession had unraveled the mystery, the hidden passage, the Codex Ravenous, the cryptic letter, and justice was now in motion. Today, Fernley Vale was stirring back to life, and Miss Marple intended to witness its healing, knowing that villages, like people, mend through shared stories and small acts of grace. News of Sylvia's arrest spread swiftly, carried by the village's ever-churning gossip mill. By mid-morning, the Rose and Crown tea shop was abuzz, its lace-curtained windows framing clusters of villagers dissecting the scandal. Miss Marple, sipping chamomile tea at a corner table, listened as Mrs. Agnes Booth, the village gossip, held court. A Prescott, that's Sylvia, but born on the wrong side of the blanket, Agnes declared, her eyes gleaming. Stabbing poor Mrs. Prescott for some old book shocking, but not surprising, with that family's curse. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking, recalling a St. Mary Mead gossip whose tales had softened scandal into a cautionary fable. She interjected gently, a sad tale, Mrs. Booth, but the village is stronger for the truth. Agnes nodded, her fervor tempered, and the conversation shifted to the upcoming fate. A sign of healing dawn at Ravenwood Lodge. The household was finding its footing. Lawrence Prescott, cleared of suspicion, stood in the conservatory, his easel bearing a new canvas, not of ravens or storms, but of the lodge's rose garden, vibrant with hope. Miss Marple joined him, her shawl draped over her shoulders. "Lawrence, dear, you've decided to keep the lodge?" she asked, her tone warm. He nodded, his dark eyes steady. "Aunt Eleanor loved this place. I'll turn it into an art school for young painters like me." "It's what she'd want." His resolve echoed a St. Mary Mead youth who'd rebuild a tarnished legacy, and Miss Marple approved, seeing in him a future free of shadows. Clara Dunhill, chastened by her role in the Codex hunt, lingered in the drawing room, her black dress less severe with a soft gray scarf. Miss Marple, sensing her turmoil, sat beside her. "Mrs. Dunhill, the past is heavy, but it need not define you," she said, her voice kind. Clara's lips trembled. "I was wrong to resent Eleanor, to chase that manuscript. I've written to Lawrence, offering to help with the school." Her reconciliation, though tentative, was genuine, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead matron whose atonement had mended a family rift. "A fine start," she murmured, her needles pausing. Knowing small gestures could heal deep wounds. Dr. Henry Vaughan, his medical bag packed, resumed his village rounds, his kindly demeanor restored. Miss Marple encountered him on the lodge's drive, where he tipped his hat. "Miss Marple, you've done Fernley Vale a service," he said, his spectacles glinting. "Eleanor's death was a tragedy, but the truth has freed us." He admitted to withholding details about Eleanor's anxiety, fearing it would taint her memory. Miss Marple nodded, understanding his loyalty, much like a St. Mary Mead doctor who'd guarded a patient's dignity. "Truth is a balm, Dr. Vaughan," she said, and he smiled, his step lighter as he headed to his next call. Miss Marple attended the village fete that afternoon. A lively affair on the green, with bunting strung between yews and stalls, offering jams, knitted scarves, and toffee. Apples. Children darted about, their laughter a counterpoint to the recent gloom, while the church choir sang hymns under Mr. Timothy Reed's direction. The vicar, his nervous tic gone, approached Miss Marple with a grateful nod. "Your insight restored." "Our peace, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "Eleanor's generosity lives on in this community." He revealed that the church's roof fund, bolstered by her donation, was complete, a legacy untainted by the Codex's curse. Miss Marple smiled, recalling a St. Mary Mead fete where a village had rallied after a scandal, its spirit unbroken. Agnes Booth, manning a cake stall, shared the latest gossip, now softened into legend. "They say the Raven's curse is broken," she whispered, offering Miss Marple a slice of Victoria sponge. "That codex is off to a museum, safe from greedy hands." The codex, per Eleanor's will, was indeed destined for the British Museum. Its alchemical secrets to be studied, not coveted. Miss Marple accepted the cake, her thoughts on a St. Mary Mead relic that had found peace in a public trust. "A fitting end," she said, her needles tucked away, sensing the village's wounds knitting together like her scarf. Back at the lodge, Miss Marple strolled the garden, where the raven statue stood sentinel, its stone eyes no longer ominous. The fates' music drifted on the breeze, a reminder of Fernley Vale's resilience. She thought of Sylvia, now awaiting trial, her desperation a cautionary tale. The young woman's actions, born of rejection, mirrored a St. Mary Mead outcast, whose bid for acceptance had ended in ruin. Yet Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve to see justice tempered with mercy. The lodge, once a crucible of secrets, was becoming a place of renewal. Its shadows dispelled by truth dot as evening fell. Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her gray tweed case neatly ordered. She joined Lawrence for tea in the drawing room, where the fire crackled with warmth. "You've given us a future, Miss Marple," he said, his voice earnest. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You've given it to yourselves, dear. Villages and families, they mend if given time." The Raven's shadow had lifted, and Fernley Vale was whole again, its story one of loss, but also of hope. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where every scandal left a lesson, and knew she'd carry this one home, ready for the next puzzle life might bring. Chapter 13. Reflections by the fire. The evening at Ravenwood Lodge wrapped Fernley Vale in a gentle hush. The sky a deep velvet pricked with stars as the scent of wood smoke drifted from the manor's chimneys. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, her favorite armchair pulled close to a crackling fire that cast flickering shadows on the oak-paneled walls. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar rhythm, a soft wool scarf growing in her lap. But her mind was alive with reflections on the case now resolved. Sylvia Trent's confession had unveiled the truth behind Eleanor Prescott's murder, the hidden passage, the Codex Ravenous, the cryptic letter, and Fernley Vale was beginning to heal. Tonight, as her time at the lodge drew to a close, Miss Marple savored the quiet, knowing that such moments offered clarity, like the final stitches in a complex pattern. The room was a haven of comfort, its chintz curtains drawn against the night, a tray of tea and shortbread on the side table. Lawrence Prescott joined her, his lanky frame settling into a chair opposite, a sketchbook open but idle in his hands. The firelight's softest features erasing the strain of recent days and his dark eyes, so like his father Reginald's, held a new resolve. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm, "I don't know how to thank you. You've given us, back the lodge, our peace." She smiled, her spectacles glinting. "Nonsense, dear. You found your own way forward. I merely tugged a few threads." Her modesty, as always, masked the precision of her insight, honed by years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead. Lawrence leaned forward, his sketchbook revealing a drawing of the lodge's rose garden, vibrant with promise. "I'm turning this place into an art school," he said, echoing his earlier vow. Eleanor would have loved it, young artists finding their voice here. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing as she shared a memory from her youth. "In St. Mary Mead, there was a girl much like you who inherited a crumbling manor. She turned it into a library, filled with children's laughter. Places like this, Lawrence, they thrive when given purpose. Her story, simple but poignant, resonated with him, and she saw in his determination a Saint Mary Mead spirit. Rebuilding after loss, their conversation turned to the case, Lawrence's curiosity piqued by Miss Marple's methods. "How do you see it all so clearly?" he asked, gesturing to her knitting. "The clues, the lies, it's like you knew from the start." She chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, I never know, dear. I watch, I listen. People are much the same everywhere, agreed. Love, fear, they leave traces." Sylvia's desperation reminded me of a St. Mary Mead lass who coveted a neighbor's heirloom, her heart set on proving herself. It ended in theft, not murder, but the pattern was there. Lawrence marveled, sketching her profile absently, capturing the quiet strength of her gaze. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead artist who'd drawn a killer's face without realizing, and she smiled, content to be his muse. The door creaked, and Inspector Grange entered, his burly frame soft by the firelight. He carried a notebook, its pages filled with the case's details, but his expression was one of grudging admiration. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair, "I owe you an apology. I thought your knitting and village tailies were a distraction, but you've outdone my lot." She waved a hand, her needles resuming. "Not at all, Inspector. You found the codex, arrested Sylvia, your work was thorough. I only saw what was plain, like a loose thread in a seam." Grange grunted, a smile tugging at his mustache. "Plain to you, maybe. That passage, the cipher, you've a mind like a trap." Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead constable who'd learned to trust her, meddling, and she warmed to Grange's respect. Grange shared that Sylvia's trial was set for the following month, her confession bolstered by the evidence, the passages wool scrap, her notebook sketches, the letter's ink matching the lodge's supply. "She's remorseful," he said, "but the law's the law." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on Sylvia's desperation, a mirror to a St. Mary Mead outcast whose bid for acceptance had ended in ruin. She wanted to belong, she murmured, but chose a dark path. "I hope the court sees her youth, her regret." Her compassion, tempered by justice, echoed her approach to many a village scandal, and Grange, sensing her wisdom, promised to note her perspective in his report. The conversation drifted to the codex, now secured for the British Museum. Its alchemical secrets to be studied, not coveted. Lawrence admitted to a fleeting temptation to keep it, but Eleanor's will was clear. "It's better this way," he said, his voice firm. "The Raven's curse was just a story, but it's done. Enough harm." Miss Marple agreed, recalling a St. Mary Mead relic that had sparked a feud until donated to a public trust. "Some treasures," she said, "are safest shared." She shared a tale of a St. Mary Mead widow whose heirloom, once a source of strife, had found peace in a museum. Its story a lesson for all Dob as the fire dwindled. Miss Marple packed her, knitting, her gray tweed suitcase waiting in her room. Lawrence escorted her to the stairs, his gratitude palpable. "You'll visit again, won't you?" he asked, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. "Friendly Vale meets you." She smiled, patting his hand. "If the roses bloom and the tea is strong, I may. But St. Mary Mead calls, dear. There's always a puzzle waiting." She thought of her village, where every cottage held a story, and felt a pang of homesickness, tempered by the satisfaction of a case well solved. Grange lingered, offering a ride to the station the next morning. "You've made a mark, Miss Marple," he said, his tone earnest. "Friendly Vale won't forget." She thanked him, her eyes twinkling. "Nor I, Inspector. Villages are like tapestries, flawed but beautiful when mended." As she climbed the stairs, the lodge's shadows felt lighter, its secrets aired like laundry on a spring day. Miss Marple paused at her window, the stars bright above the oaks and reflected on the raven's shadow, now dispelled. She thought of a St. Mary, Mead mystery where a single truth had healed a rift, and knew Ravenwood's story would endure, a testament to human frailty and resilience. Chapter 14. Home to St. Mary Mead, the morning of Miss Jane Marple's departure from Ravenwood. Lodge dawned with a soft brilliance, the Devon hills awash in the tender light of spring. The air carried the scent of damp earth and budding roses, a farewell gift from Fernley Vale as she prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, her gray tweed suitcase, neatly packed with her blue cardigan and knitting, stood by the lodge's grand staircase, a silent testament to her brief but transformative stay. The resolution of Eleanor Prescott's murder, Sylvia Trent's confession, the Codex Ravenous's discovery, the unraveling of the Raven's shadow had restored peace to the village, and Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. As she sipped her final cup of tea in the drawing room, her needles clicking softly, she reflected on the case, knowing that every mystery, like a skein of wool, left lessons in its threads. Lawrence Prescott joined her for breakfast, his lanky frame less restless now, his dark eyes bright with purpose. The lodge, soon to become an art school, hummed with potential, its shadows dispelled. "Miss Marple," he said, buttering a scone, "you've changed Fernley Vale. I wish you'd stay for the Fates' closing day." She smiled, her spectacles glinting in the morning light. "Tempting, dear, but my garden in St. Mary Mead is calling, and Cherry will have tales to share. Villages, are never truly quiet." Her words echoed a St. Mary Mead truth, where every hedgerow hid a story, and Lawrence nodded, sketching her silhouette on a napkin. Capturing her serene strength. Miss Marple strolled the lodge's garden one last time, her sensible shoes crunching. On the gravel path, the raven statue, once a symbol of secrets, stood benign under the sun, its stone eyes no longer ominous. She paused by the rosebeds, their blooms a vivid contrast to the case's darkness, and thought of Sylvia, whose desperation for belonging had led to tragedy. The young woman's fate, awaiting trial, weighed on Miss Marple, tempered by hope for redemption. She recalled a St. Mary Mead girl, driven to theft by a need to prove herself, who'd found peace through mercy. "Human nature," she murmured, her shawl catching the breeze, "is both frail and resilient." Inspector Grange arrived to escort her to the station, his burly frame softened by a rare smile. "Miss Marple, you're a marvel," he said, loading her suitcase into the police car. "That passage, the Codex, you saw what I blundered past." She waved a hand, her needles tucked into her bag. "Nonsense, Inspector. You tied the knots. I only straightened the threads. Fernley Vale is lucky to have you." Her modesty, as always, masked her skill, honed by years of unraveling St. Mary Mead scandals. Grange chuckled, admitting he'd read her name in old case files from other villages. "You're a legend, whether you admit it or not," he said, and she thought of a St. Mary Mead constable who dubbed her the village sleuth, a title she wore lightly. The drive to Fernley Vale station wound through lanes flanked by hedgerows and grazing sheep, the village green alive with the Fates' final preparations. Miss Marple glimpsed Mrs. Agnes Booth arranging cakes, her gossip now softened into tales of the Raven's End, and Mr. Timothy Reed directing choir practice, his tick gone. The Codex, destined for the British Museum, had lifted the Prescott curse, and Fernley Vale was knitting itself whole. She recalled a St. Mary Mead fate where a scandal's resolution had sparked renewal. The village stronger for its scars stood at the station, a quaint platform bordered by primroses. Miss Marple boarded the train, her ticket tucked into her reticule. Grange tipped his hat, his voice earnest. "If St. Mary Mead ever tires you, Fernley Vale's doors are open." She smiled, settling into her seat. "A kind offer, Inspector, but home calls. There's always a new puzzle in my village. As the train chugged forward, the Devon hills faded, replaced by the familiar contours of her thoughts. She opened her notebook, its pages filled with jottings on the Ravenwood case, the letters flourish, the passages damp stones, Sylvia's tearful confession. Each detail was a lesson, a mirror to St. Mary Mead's own dramas. Miss Marple reflected. On the raven's shadow, a metaphor for secrets that fester until aired. The codex, with its alchemical promise, had been a false grail, its true value in the truth it revealed. She thought of a St. Mary Mead heirloom, coveted until donated, its piece a communal gift. Sylvia's story, like so many, was one of longing. Twisted into harm, a pattern Miss Marple had seen as St. Mary Mead outcast, whose theft had echoed this murder. People, she murmured, her needles resuming in her lap, are their own greatest mystery. The train neared St. Mary Mead, its spire visible through the window, and Miss Marple felt a surge of warmth. Cherry, her maid, would be waiting. With tea and gossip, perhaps, news of the new family at Gossington Hall, hinting at future intrigues. The station platform, with its familiar bench and flower baskets, welcomed her as she alighted, her suitcase light in her hand. Cherry's cheerful voice greeted her. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've been missed. There's talk of a missing brooch at the vicarage. Nothing serious, mind, but you'll sort it." Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "One puzzle at a time, Cherry. First tea." At her cottage, the lavender-bordered path led to a door wreathed in clematis, and Miss Marple settled by her window, the sunset painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. Her knitting resumed, the scarf a quiet companion to her thoughts. Ravenwood's enigma was solved, its lessons etched in her memory, the passage's secret, the codex's lure, the fragility of human hearts. St. Mary Mead, with its own secrets, awaited her keen eye, and she was ready, as always, for the next thread to tap. "Life," she murmured, her needles clicking softly, "is a tapestry, ever unfinished." The fire crackled, the village hummed, and Miss Marple smiled, content, in the certainty that no mystery was too tangled for her to unravel.